All right. So I want you all to imagine Christ. Come up with whatever image normally comes up when you are imagining Christ. And I'm wondering, maybe some of you imagined Christ as a babe in the manger. Or maybe some of you as a grown man with a beard, or as Jesus the shepherd, the good shepherd. And then there's this very famous English artist, William Holman Hunt, who did this Light of the World back in the mid-1800s. And then this is probably the most ubiquitous one in the West of Warner Salmon. It's done by Warner Salmon, and the painting was done in 1940 and was called The Son of Man. And it's probably the most ubiquitous image of Christ in Western Christianity because there were more copies of this printed than there are citizens in the United States. And the original sketch, he said that he woke up with a dream or revelation of it and did a little sketch and then made a life-size sketch back in 1920 for a church who commissioned him to do the cover of their quarterly publication called Covenant Garden. And it wasn't until 1940 that he went on to paint it, and then it became known as the Head of Christ. And then through the YMCA and the Salvation Army, they were printed and distributed to every person in the armed forces during World War II and to every religiously affiliated hospital bed in the United States. So this became the enduring image for many for generations. And it is, of course, very white, reflecting the artist's Swedish heritage. And it was commissioned by an evangelical church in the Midwest. So it really reflected his own heritage and the church for which it was commissioned. And it is completely ahistorical. But that is not uncommon. That wasn't even uncommon back in the Middle Ages during Renaissance art with Caravaggio. People have often depicted Jesus reflecting the people in their community, both in their features, their face, and in their clothing and in the background. So I just want to point that out. And many people thought that this was a great work because Solomon had hidden the host and the chalice in the picture. So there you can see the host. And here you can see the chalice here around the temple. And so for many, that made it particularly meaningful. Now, Billy Graham back in 1957 said this work is probably more satisfying to Americans than the more ancient conceptions which portrayed Christ as weak and emaciated. And we're going to talk about that. But first, a word on the cross. So Christian scripture suggests that the art of the divine is the whole of creation, life, and the human form. All are the product of God's creative process. So the question is, then, what is the Christian art of man? Well, there was actually a time before we had the era of art. In fact, the very term art for its own sake was not even conceptualized until after the Middle Ages. Prior to that era, prior to the era of art, most early religious images worked for a living, as Eamon Duffy would always say. They worked for a living and were not considered art. They served a purpose and they were to tell you what the community believed. So tonight, I'm going to briefly trace a few cherry-picked images of the cross and the crucifixion and discuss how they might provide some insight into how Christians at different moments in time understood their faith and enacted it. And hopefully you will be able to see how theology, our understanding of God, is mediated through the image, and how social and political and cultural and personal factors, as well as the purpose of its intended use, reflect the theology of that time and place and community. In other words, the images that a person or a community gazes upon, it embodies the theological thought of that person or that church or community. Now, historically, I want to say at the outset, historically, and I mean by the first 400 years or so after the crucifixion of Christ, there was barely any use of a cross as a symbol of Christianity, barely any use of it. And when it was used, it never had a body on it. It was just the cross. And so it made many people wonder why. And several theories have been posited for this. And one theory suggests that the crucifixion was not central to the early Christians. But I think this is probably the worst theory because it's at odds with the text, particularly all. I don't think that is a good theory. And another theory is that depicting the crucifixion would somehow profane a holy mystery and undermine the Christian emphasis on resurrection. There was also some concern expressed by the early fathers about this, because any representation of Jesus could only depict his humanity and not his divinity, and therefore might be intrinsically heretical. And a third theory, which Richard Harries, a very noted scholar, subscribes to, is that the issue was not only the question of whether one can, the issue was Christians may have been reluctant to show a crucified Christ on the cross because of the stigma due to its association with judicial execution. It would be akin to having your leader sentenced and executed on an electric chair, like a common criminal. And it would not only be gruesome, but it would be disgraceful. So several historians and scholars really, I think, go with this theory on why the cross was not depicted. And this argument also has to do with propriety, some say, and even security, because Christians in those first few couple hundred years, 300-400 years, they had a reason to fear the scorn and misunderstanding of their neighbors. And especially when they were just emerging from an already minority sect, a Jewish sect, and that early leaders were being martyred. So there is some evidence that that suggests that Christians, if they were to use the cross a lot, would be subject to scorn, and we'll see that a little bit later. So tonight I'm going to talk really more about the crucifixion as it was depicted in visual images, and not other images of Christ, like the ones I showed you earlier, but pictures of the cross, and many of them crucifixions, which means a body on the cross. So I just start you off with this one because it's so shocking. I imagine when you were imagining Jesus, when I asked you at the beginning to imagine Jesus, that this was not probably what came to most of your minds. This is a painful, emaciated, excruciating image. And it's titled "The Tortured Christ" by sculptor Guido Rocca in 1975. And it was displayed at the World Council of Churches Assembly in Nairobi that year. And in front of the sculpture was this quote from the artist. And it said, "Today, increasingly, the so-called Western Christian civilization, the Christ of the oppressors is the one which submits without struggle to exploitation, absolves the sins of the torturers, and threatens with hell the laziness of the undernourished peasant's son." For us, as artists of Latin America, the Christ of the oppressed is born in the soul of the people. His cry is a weapon of struggle, who creates out of his weakness the strength to struggle against the So this was so shocking back in 1975 that the WCC had it removed because it was too disturbing, which in and of itself is disturbing. Because if you really think about it, what could possibly be more disturbing than executing the most innocent human to ever walk the face of this earth? And to do so and to execute him in such a gruesome manner. There's a price we pay when we can only accept undisturbing views or images of Christ on the cross. To this artist who created this image that you're seeing right now, he himself was a victim of torture. And he said that this crucifixion for him is a symbol of hope. So I want to start back at the very beginning. So imagine Jesus is crucified around 32, 33 AD, and used for the first, say, 400 years. Catacombs deep under Rome. They used many images of Christ. They used images of Christ as the Good Shepherd. The image you can find in the catacombs of a Christ, or of a cross, I'm sorry. And it's the Pax cross, the cross of peace. And this is probably mid 300s. And it starts emerging, we think, then, because Christians were finding meaning at that point in the resurrection. They were finding the crucifixion but we start to see second and third centuries, this understanding emerging. So the crucifixion and the resurrection, here we've got the peace sign. And then this is the Alpha and the Omega on either side. And this, the family placed there on the tomb with an inscription that was thereby proclaiming that they had put their trust in God, who through the cross of his son brought peace now and forever and for all eternity. And that was the inscription that they put right by this cross. Now, this is a carving on a sarcophagus in one of the catacombs. And there again, and you can see the wreath there and the crown.
I've tried that. Well,
hang on.
Fine for me, Beth.
Angela, can you mute them?
Yes.
Be important historically. It derived from a vision of, and this, here you just have the cross with the holy. And so you kind of see that the Christian image is being adopted and then transformed, or transforming many Roman imperial images, so that they actually became part of the Christian narrative. Here's the earliest noting, but as you can see, he's not on a cross. So that's the earliest one from 240, just to let you know. Now, what I'm going to show you next is the earliest known depiction of Christ, or a body on a man. And you can see this is a horse or a donkey's head, and it's known as the ass-headed crucifixion. And it came up around, or it was done around early 3rd century. And it's of early graffito that says, there's an inscription here that says, Anaxagoras worships his God. So this is mocking him, basically telling him that his God is an ass. This man that died on a cross was an ass. And it was found on the door of a servant's quarters in the Palatine Palace, and you can still see it there in the forum at the museum there. But this goes back to the early theories on why we think that they didn't use the cross as a symbol in early Christian images, because it made the early Christians subject to scorn and ridicule. And Paul, if you recall, spoke of Christ crucified, not just Christ, but Christ crucified, as a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. So it was very early on a reason to be ridiculed. So that's the earliest known piece. But around the same time, this magical amulet was found. And this is a little bit later than this piece. This is probably 50 years later. And although Christian, it often did make them subject to ridicule, they were nonetheless, we do earlier when it was just the cross, because they were viewing it now of the resurrection. And so that's why we started to see 1 or 2 crosses, those peace crosses in the catacombs. But here, even people outside of the religion, outside of Christianity, recognized that Jesus had some power over death. And so here you see Jesus on the cross, on this engraved stone, and it's covered with all sorts of magical names. And it appears, like I said, that even non-Christians viewed, in pagan circles, they had this notion that Christ was giving them power over death. Nailed, but is strapped to the cross. There are straps here, and he's got a beard, and he's naked, and his legs are akimbo. So it's a very unorthodox use of a Christian image. But now you can see that theology, where they had been embarrassed for at least 200 years to even mention the cross or use it. You can start seeing it creeping into the imagery of Christians. And so here is a gemstone, I think that was on a ring. And this is from mid-4th century, so like around 350. And it's unusual because instead of just Mary and John at the crucifixion, all the apostles are present. You see that? So you have the conversion of Constantine around 314. And by the end of the 300s, crucifixion is outlawed. There's no longer execution by crucifixion, but also Christianity becomes the religion of the empire. And so now there is less reason to be afraid or scared of using the cross for imagery. And so by the 400s, you see this kind of imagery of Christ on the cross. And this is very different than you probably think of, but it's Christ triumphant. This is a tiny little plaque, by the way. It's about the size of a postage stamp, and it's in the British Museum. But once Christianity became the religion of the empire and the emperor, there was less need to assert the religion's respectability and dignity. And so here, this is the earliest known surviving example, Jesus on the ring with all the apostles, and the one of him akimbo on that magical amulet were very unorthodox. So by the 400s, this is the emerging image. And if you notice, it's an image of Christ triumphant. And see how buff he is? His eyes are wide open. He's very healthy. You can see his muscles. And in fact, it looks like he's almost standing. Often he's standing on a little ledge. So that's interesting. It doesn't portray a realistic history again. And if you notice, this is juxtaposed with this image, and this is Judas after Judas died by suicide. And he's just, so Judas is dangling from a tree that is alive, while Jesus stands on a cross made from the tree that's now dead. And it highlights this paradox that it was through death that Christ brings life, and that the dead tree of the cross is a sign of eternal life. So this is Christ victorious, body upright, arms outreached, eyes open, wearing a loincloth, and looking as if he's almost superimposed on that cross. And he's young, he's beardless, he's long-haired, vigorous, strong body, all a sign of his divinity. And if there's any doubt of his divinity, his head is surrounded by, you can't really see it very well, but there's a nimbus there of glory. So this is the Apollonic, beautiful Christ with that robust body. And that's what you're going to see for hundreds of years. And the theological narrative purpose of the panel is that the cross is no longer a symbol of a degrading execution, but you see they've flipped it, inverted it, and now it's an object of devotion in a dramatic moment of salvation history. It's triumphant. So I hope maybe this will give you a better idea, but here's Jesus is crucified. Here's where we see the graffito on the palace making fun of the servant for worshiping an ass god who was killed on a cross. And probably, so around the time Constantine converts, and I'm sorry, I think he converted in 314, although there's arguments whether it was the beginning of his time at the Milvian Bridge or right before death, but right around that time, when he outlaws crucifixions, that we start seeing the cross emerging in the catacombs. And it's related to the resurrection, that you're going to have eternal peace, peace in this life and peace in the next. And then by the 400s, and you see that's long enough that nobody who would have witnessed a crucifixion would still be alive, that you start seeing Christ victorious now. Enough time has passed. So then you go on to this. Here's some more. This is from the wooden doors of St. Sabina's Church in Rome, and it's around 432. So again, about 100 years after crucifixions were outlawed, and it's pretty, it's an Orthodox piece, and around the same time as that ivory plaque we just looked at. And here again, he's got this strong, buff body, symbol of divinity, virtually stands on the cross, is fully alive with his eyes wide open, and again in a loincloth like we saw back in this depiction. And as you see these two pieces together, it really shows how the cross has been completely transformed from that symbol of humiliation into a symbol of honor and glory and victory over death, and in a word, resurrection. And it remained like this for centuries. Here's a little exception, and this is about 6th century, and you can still, it still looks like Christ is alive and triumphant. This comes from the Rabula Gospel, a illuminated gospel that's very famous. But in this, you can see a slight shift, in the way the crucifixion is being juxtaposed with the resurrection, is exemplified in this work. Louise, so we can, I hear Archie. Thank you, Louise. So up here, we've got Christ, but down here we have the empty grave. And so it's being juxtaposed with that resurrection in this bottom panel, with the empty tomb and the guards being thrust back as the doors burst open. And there's also another notable development in the theology around this time. We begin to see hints, just hints of the suffering Christ. And that's up here. And although Christ appears very much alive on the cross, he is clearly being tortured with spears. And his expression is no longer victorious. Let me see. See, it's more sad. Not that fully alive, but so now we're starting to see this change and shift in the theology towards more of a suffering Christ. And we're fully there in the suffering Christ when we get to, this is from 1022. So beginning really more in the late 8th century up to the 11th century, the image of Christ on the cross has significantly changed. So in contrast with those earliest depictions of Christ victorious and very much alive on the cross in both the West, which was the ivory little plaque, but then that Rabula example I gave you, this is Eastern Orthodox, this and this. So in the East and the West, you had this Christ victorious, but now in this, we are clearly into suffering Christ. And by the end of this period, you're going to see Jesus dead on the cross. And this kind of reflects a changing theology of changing Christology. And one of the major theological debates going on between the 4th century and the 8th century concerned the person and the humanity of Christ. And so here they were very much trying to bridge that gap by making it clear that Christ was crucified as a human being, but by keeping his eyes wide open, you could still be interpreting it as the divine logos. And then once the controversy settled down, artists were free to depict the human nature of Christ with impunity, because if the divine logos had become truly human, then he must have truly died. And theologically, he needed to truly die for the crucifixion and the resurrection to be meaningful. So this is a mosaic here that begins to illustrate the dead and suffering Christ. And the emphasis now is on his suffering. The image is on his sacrifice being complete. And you can see blood is just pouring from him, from his hands, from his feet. So you can just see how it's definitely changed by this time. And let me give you this, probably my all-time favorite. So this is the Eisenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunwald. And this is right dead 1515. And Christ here was said to share our suffering. And here, right now, shows it in a museum, but it's huge. This right here is over 9 feet tall. It's just it's larger than life. So that, I guess I included this to give you an idea of how big this piece is. And I want to look at it more closely. First starting on his head and just how detailed and graphic this piece is. And it probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that it was originally commissioned to be in a monastery where they treated people who were really ill with things like leprosy and other skin conditions. And so this invited the viewer to contemplate their own participation in Christ's suffering and sacrifice on 2 levels. First, its location as an altarpiece, it was on the altar there, would remind the person who is looking at it that Christ is the sacrifice, and through the Eucharist we share in it. But it also informs whoever's looking at it that Christ knows our suffering. So that's kind of amazing, and just the detail of the suffering. And this was also during a time, when the plague was going through, and this shows the gangrene setting in. It's just, I think, one of the most spectacular pieces of that time. And you can see how the theology now has changed, that they're not afraid to show Christ suffering now or Christ dead, and that the humanity, the human side of Christ. And that took a lot of time to hammer out. And then we get to this. And this is in stark contrast with that hyper magnified perspective of suffering that we just saw depicted in that Grunwald piece. This is during the Romantic period of landscapes just a few centuries later. But it's also, as we start becoming more industrialized And there was the rise of the individual in contrast to that traditional collective sense of identity. So we're having the rise of the individual as manifested in our own Declaration of Independence. And the economics and theology of Adam Smith, and arguably the Reformation of itself, can be seen in this. It's more of that individual movement. And it began to reflect individual artists' images as opposed to those earlier images. And then I want to move on to this. This is probably one that you all know well, the Dolly piece. Now, this is arguably art for art's sake. This was not necessarily commissioned to be in a monastery where there were sick people who were suffering to gaze upon. This is Salvador Dali's 19th century work, The Christ of St. John on the Cross. And it was done in 1951. Like I said, it wasn't commissioned for a religious community or as a personal devotional piece. It was just produced as an expression of Dali's mystical period. And I love the fact that it has two different perspectives, and one is as if you were God looking down on your son, and then one is down here on earth. So it gives you both the perspective of humans and the divine, which I just think is a brilliant way to incorporate both the humanity and the divinity of Christ into one picture. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. All right, this one, many people found this one very offensive. It was called Piss Christ, and it's a 1987 photograph taken by an American artist and photographer, Andre Serrano. And it depicts a small plastic crucifix submerged in a glass of the artist's urine. And the piece was the winner of the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Arts Awards in the Visual Arts competition. But it met with outrage. But when you think about Christ being fully human, that this work kind of expresses the messiness of being incarnation, the messiness of birth, and birth in a smelly stable with all the blood and bodily fluids involved in childbirth, that perhaps this is more accurate and more truthful and less profane than Dali's attempt, if you think about it, to beautify the torture and the cruelty of the cross. So on second thought, this may not be as offensive as we initially thought. The cross should be offensive. And somehow it's lost its offensiveness over the centuries. And now we wear diamond crosses around our necks. And, we've forgotten how offensive it was and why the early Christians for the first 400 years wouldn't even depict it. And then as we continue on, this is called The Last of the Believers. And it was done by the Hawaiian artist Daria Font in 2000. And she's looking at it as Jesus as a woman. And here's her quote. She says, "I think in general, I could say that I'm trying to call attention to the sacrifice that women often make in relationships their families, or in their jobs, and often feel a sense of martyrdom. So the woman, a Catholic nun who introduced me to this painting, told me about a woman who was the victim of domestic violence and had a real problem with the cross that was in her church, and felt like the church had glorified torture and abuse and violence by having a crucifix so front and center during worship. But somehow this image helped her, this image of Christ as a woman, helped her relate to that Christ better and see that his sacrifice and that he was like, and realized, or she realized, that God transcends all sex and gender. So that made it much easier for her. And this is by Roger Wagner. And you can see Christ here, but it's set up like a menorah. And when you consider the contemporary era, this really pushes the boundaries on whether it's religious or about religion, and raises a lot of questions. And some people think that the artist cannibalized the crucifix for his own purposes. But I don't know. I don't know. I think it has a lot to say about the modern age. And from there, as we continue to look at how now the crucifix is being depicted in our age, like this, I consider this our age, it also becomes a place for political comment, like this. And now we've moved into crucifixion art as editorial and political statements. And this piece was done by a Cuban photographer, Eric Ravello. And he did a string of these. And this photo shows both the direct and indirect violence against children via religion. And he does it through other contexts like military occupation, healthcare, school shootings, sexual tourism. And I don't know if you can see it, but he pixelated the children's faces, which I think makes it even more powerful. Here's one. And there's another one. So I'm going to give you guys a pop quiz. I took a picture of this cross as I was leaving the Met one day. And I think I left out an important slide for you all, but how would you guys date it? You note that there's no corpus on the cross. So you know that means it either has to be pre-5th century, because we didn't get the corpus, with the exception of the graffiti and the amulet. We didn't get actual Christian depictions of a body on the cross until the 5th century. So this has to be pre-5th century, or it could be post-Reformation. And that's the slide I think I may have forgotten to show you all. So one of the big movements post-Reformation, so you had that Grunwald piece in 1515 of the suffering of Christ that was for the lepers. But shortly after the Reformation, you get the Protestant Reformation, and they completely take the corpus off the cross. So in most Protestant churches that you walk into, if there is not a corpus on the cross, you know why. It's probably a Protestant church. You will walk into some Episcopal churches and see a body on the cross, particularly Anglo-Catholic Episcopal churches will have that. So when you look at a piece, you should ask, was this, where was it? Where's this particular cross situated? Is it an individual expression of the artist, like Dolly's, or was it commissioned for a specific church or community? Is it being displayed in somebody's home or in a place of worship? All of these will tell us interesting things about the visual theology. So this one that we're looking at right here was made in the 500s. And it's from Syria, possibly Antioch, and is one of the largest early crosses to survive that time. And it was a processional cross. And here's the cross from our church. Now, you guys probably know more about this than I do. So tell us whatever you may know. Unmute yourself and let us know.
Well, when we went through something called Vision 87, which added the narthex and the side aisles to the main part of the church, the cross, we decided we had to move the altar to the center. It had been smack up against the wall, but that was moved forward and made so that we could stand all around it, not just pushed aside.
So what do you know about the cross, Betsy?
Yeah, okay, so I've got to lead up to this. So right above the altar in the original church was a big white cross, bigger than this. And so when part of Vision 87 was putting in a new organ. And so they took off the cross, the big white cross, and put it at the very back of the church, above the doors where you go out into the narthex. And for years, when you sat in a pew, there was no cross that you looked at. And if you were, been going there for years, you kept thinking, well, where's the cross? Only if you were the priest and standing behind the altar could you see the old cross, because it was now straight in front of the priest, but the congregation didn't see it. So when Scott Hayashi became our priest, a delegation, sort of very informal delegation, went to him and said, look, we would like to look at a cross when we're seated in the pews. And so we raised money and we hired this outfit in the East Bay that had done the stained glass windows on the new side aisles of the church. And he designed this cross, which changes color as you move from one side to the other, depending on the light that shines on it. So that's how that got there.
Yeah. So here's the white cross at the back of the church that you were just describing, at the back of the narthex as you walk out. So yeah, it's really interesting. So not only does the cross, but the architecture tells you a whole lot about a parish. And so the fact that this parish would place an organ front and center and take off its cross is really unusual and tells you a lot about the parish at that time. Yeah. Or who was called.
I want to interrupt you with
another
perspective. In my day, of course, Scott Hayashi's cross was not there. And the cross was over the exit, which is, in fact, I think, a wonderful statement of the notion that our ministry and our following of the cross takes place as we exit and as we go into the world and as we serve others. Not that we worship it as something of its own, but that it is a symbol of our ministry and the sacrifice made for us so that we might serve others. and it serves to commemorate, to mark the servant's entrance, not the servant's entrance coming in, but the servant's entrance going out into the world. So
Like
what do
our
you think-
post-communion prayer says.
What do you think of that?
I think that's great and well said. Just like our post-communion prayer says, now bless us to go out into the world to love and serve you with gladness and singleness of heart. And to see that cross, and you take your cross out to the world, is beautiful. So something more, at least that was told to me or in the stuff, was that this that the cross is actually made out of a metal that was used on the space shuttle, and that so it can take like enormous heat and does change color, but it comes from a very high-tech NASA alloy, which I thought was fascinating. And so when you see it without a corpus on it, you can pretty much guarantee that you're not in a Catholic church. So that's what you know. And if you know what these metals are made from, I can't imagine anything more appropriate for a Silicon Valley church that's high tech and that has a lot of scientists in it, you know, that is very incredibly reflective of the congregation. And so I think that is just genius and brilliant on their part when they were designing it, because it does tell you something very specific about our theology and about this particular congregation.
Well, of course, I remember that argument that Chris just gave. I mean, that's what was told to us for several years. Just get used to it, people. You know, you don't need to worship a cross. You don't really need it up there. And finally, I guess enough people said, you know what? Yeah, but we do miss it. Maybe
you know what? Where it even speaks to our Episcopalianism and that we're both and. So
yes, it's fine.
So it's nice because traditionally many people walk into a church and they venerate the cross before they slip into their pew. And so I like having both and.
Well, the other argument was against it is that when we had, you know, the chalice, the vested chalice, those covers have a cross. And they said, well, if you need to look at a cross, you can look at that. Well, you know, we don't even do that anymore. So it's nice to have it up there.
Well, I think I can guess what side you are on. But now, hopefully everybody, you can have the cross coming and going at Christ Church. That's the beautiful thing about it. So here's another depiction of Christ in the feminine. That's at St. John the Divine Cathedral in New York City. And then I just want to end with this, that, you know, don't stay on the cross. Remember that there's resurrection. And this is a beautiful thing in the Synod Hall at Vatican City. Look how big that is. So yeah, so it's very interesting, but hopefully you guys can kind of date. You can tell between Catholic, Protestant crosses. You can kind of tell the era, whether or not it's Christ victorious or Christ suffering or Christ dead or Christ isolated. And then when we get into Christ as art, like this, that's a chocolate Christ. So yeah, so I hope this was informative for you all. Thank you. Thank you for joining. And do you have any questions or any thoughts or ones that you were surprised by or hadn't seen before?
It's interesting when you showed the pictures of Jesus at the beginning, because I don't think I had seen the one from the Midwest until I came to America. The Holman Hunt I went to see in St. Paul's Cathedral when I was 10 on a trip to London with my mother. because that's what is often shown in Sunday school to people
Yeah,
in Britain.
Yeah, I consider these very, I consider these siblings, even though they're separated by about 100 years.
There's another Holman hunt, the Shadow of Death, which I haven't seen what the Shadow of Death looks like, but apparently that's about the cross.
So
my other thoughts were the Celtic cross, which where I come from in Yorkshire, there's one in the churchyard that they actually had to take inside to a museum because of acid rain, was sort of making it not so nice. But in Iona or places, you have a cross and it has a circle round in the cross, and that's a Celtic cross.
mhm.
And then the other one is Coventry Cathedral that was burned in the war. They have a cross made of nails. From the nails of the cross of the church when it was bombed, there were nails left when the rest of the things had burned down, and they got the charred timbers from the roof. And so there's one in Kiev, I think, and people make necklaces of the nail crosses from Coventry.
Yeah, I meant to throw one of those in there about that. We, as part of our pilgrimage in school, went to Coventry, and they presented us with one of those to take back to Yale. Yeah. So
with the Celtic,
I have it right here.
yeah, with the Celtic crosses, there's also a circle incorporated along, usually with the a variety of Celtic knots, but the circle represents the eternal life of the Druidic religion, and where they tried to incorporate the Druidic beliefs with the Christian beliefs shortly after Patrick converted the country. So, so that's the reason there's so much pre-Christian symbolism in this in that cross.
yeah, and it also, I mean, they've done that. So like I said, the crosses reflect the cultural time, and it's a reflection of the theology and the culture and the politics of the time and place. So remember that wreath back at the very beginning, back in the catacombs, that was one of the Roman imperial symbols for the emperor. And so, which is very similar to the circle of the Celtic cross. I just happened to find this Celtic cross when I Googled it, but yeah, that's very similar to the things that we saw in the catacombs.
Yeah, and for a long time in Ireland, they didn't believe in having any kind of human symbolism. Again, they cut off from the church around the time of the 4th or 5th century. And so Ireland kind of went its own way, and the rest of Europe went into a deep, dark pit intellectually. So they were still operating with a lot of the beliefs from the late 4th century, which is the reason that there wasn't nearly as much. It's more symbolic and less figurative.
Beth, could you or would you put back up that, as you said, the most westernized, the most printed, painting of, this was the first time either I had heard or paid attention to there being the image of the host and the chalice. That was
right there.
Yeah, I just said, oh my, that was eye-opening.
Well, now you won't be able to not see it.
I know, right?
Every time you see it. It's one of those things. So this image is taking, a lot of flack because it's so white and so ahistorical, but all of them are. Like this might be closer to it. I don't know, but each, when you look at the depictions, like here you've got, it started off with him being, alive in this loincloth and buff. But then here they've changed his clothing, which was more typical of the clothing of the day. Now he's got on a whole tunic. See, so, and then if you go to things of, Rembrandt or Caravaggio, they're wearing clothing of, Jesus is wearing clothing of that era in that community in that part of Italy, so we do kind of, I think it's not just this artist, Solomon, who did it. Virtually every artist, is doing a depiction of the cross or the crucifixion for their time and place and in their community. But I do think it's important that we start showing maybe more historically accurate versions of the crucifixion and showing Jesus as a person of color. Because I don't know how that got forgotten, but.
Well, if you go to Latin America, my family started going down to Latin America when I was 5 in 1939. And I had grown up in an Episcopal church with just plain crosses. And you get down to the churches, especially in the smaller villages, and Christ on the cross is bloody. He's not only emaciated, he's also bloody. Blood is streaming all over his body.
I was just going to say that, yes.
When I was just horrified. I mean, I was really scared. And I mean, it's not even stylized. I mean, these are realistic, painters from,
maybe
the 1600s.
More like this.
Well, yeah, but even more gory and more bloody and less, well, that's sort of pretty in a way. But anyway.
That's pretty gory.
Asked one of the priests who was showing us around one time, I forget where it was, maybe it's Peru. And he said, well, we do this because the people are so poor and they are so tortured and they have to feel that Jesus was tortured just like they are being tortured. So this makes him accessible to the people that we serve. Okay.
Exactly. So that's what they started doing around this time. Starting probably around 8th to 10th century, where they were starting to show the suffering of Christ, and then even Christ dead on the cross.
Yeah, in the Cusco School of Art in Peru, after the Renaissance, some Italians went from Italy to Peru to teach people how to do Renaissance art. And that was when they decided they wanted a bloodier Christ. And it's sort of more dripping blood than the blood on that.
Spots, I mean, draining out. Yes, I know, it's really amazing. Anyway, I was glad to know why, because it's horrifying to a child who wasn't used to looking at that.
So on my mother's side, she was a Burke, and the Burkes did their genealogy back a zillion years. And one of the Burkes was Baldwin II, who was a king during the Crusader period in Jerusalem. And so when we were in Jerusalem, I wanted to go see in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where he had been entombed. And he was entombed just underneath where the Catholics believe the cross was, on the hill of Golgotha. He was kicked out by the Greeks about 150 years ago. They relocated, he and his wife, but they were there for about 1,000 years. And so, but it was just, it was also fascinating to be right underneath the hill where this happened.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. And